and welcome back to my channel. In case you missed it, I recently did a talk for BSides San Diego Unplugged. This shirt indicates I also worked the conference doing a little security stuff like usual. And with that out of the way, I'm gonna start this talk. It is called I Have a Plan, Attacks. Where did I come up with the name of this talk? Well,
we need a plan of attack.
I have a plan. Attack.
Okay, and for this presentation, I'll start off with a brief introduction. Some of you have been following me for a little bit already know who I am, but this will be for those of you that are new. Then I'll talk about some problems, specifically what this talk is going to be addressing. And as a good boss once told me, don't just come up with problems, bring solutions as well to the table. So that's where the solution is going to come into play here. Normally, I would have reserved this for Q&A. In fact, I did do that during the live talk, and there were lots of good questions. But for this one, because it's online and not live, feel free to leave questions and comments in the comment section. Start a dialogue there. Now on to a disclaimer before I begin. I consulted ChatGPT, although that is not official legal advice. But it does give a good summation of me saying I'm not a lawyer or an accountant, and more importantly, I'm not your lawyer or your accountant. So it's your responsibility to do your due diligence to ensure you get the correct questions answered specific to your situation and circumstances. Depending on where you live, what you do for work, what you want to do for work, and all these other factors, those things will be part of what answer you get out of consulting those professionals. Now for our obligatory intro. I am originally from San Diego and currently live there. I guess that makes me an endangered species by those standards. I also did a brief stint in the United States Navy, started off my career working in IT on board the USS John C. Stennis. As far as hobbies go, I've definitely accumulated lots of different hobbies over the years. I tend to kind of pick up a thing I'm interested in, go down a rabbit hole, move on to the next thing. So if anything, my hobby is learning things and feeding my brain, acquiring a strange set of skills as if they're Pokemon, and they're not always practical out the gate, but somewhere down the line they end up serving some kind of use or benefiting me somehow. So lifelong learner is my hobby, yes. Okay, so I'm going to address two different groups for this presentation. The first being those that don't have limited experience, as in this isn't your first rodeo, you've been doing this for a little bit. And then the next one's going to be people with limited experience. A lot of you trying to get your foot in the door in your first InfoSec gig or cybersecurity gig. Some of them may have already coming from IT, like an adjacent field like DevOps or software dev, or working at a help desk, service desk, any of the other jobs that are kind of outside of the realm of security but still in your IT department. This also speaks to people that are in school or about to start school or pursue this path, and they're working in a field outside of IT altogether. Okay, for my first audience for this talk, the not so limited experience, meaning not your first rodeo, you've been doing this for a while or even just a few years. One question that should resonate with you, regardless of which side of the interview table you've been on, would be how you keep your skills up to date. That's where a lot of this was inspired by. You know, there's a lot of free stuff like podcasts and things like that. And, you know, a lot of stuff on the internet that's free. Want to go down the pen testing rabbit hole? You can do stuff like VulnHub, building your own VM with some vulnerable apps, and doing a bunch of other things. But at some point, you hit this wall where things start costing money. It might be something as small as $15 a month, or it might be a SANS course, which is a lot more than 15. In some cases, you have a good situation where your company will fund those things with a budget or desired training. There's also some things where they may want you to go down a certain training path for specific technologies they use. So, for instance, if they are a shop that uses a handful of specific tools from one vendor, they might want you to go down the rabbit hole for training for that vendor. However, you run into this thing too, where your current role, even at that company that pays for the training for that vendor, might not align with your current interests 100%, or even all the way to 0. And how do you fund that stuff is where it gets challenging. So stuff, I remember there was places I worked in the past that were like, oh, cool, you're going to DEF CON, that's awesome. Or, oh, no, you're going to DEF CON, that's not so awesome. And a lot of the stuff throughout my time trying to get into security, I had to pay for out of pocket. Aside from that, even before I had interest in security, it was going down the rabbit hole of I want to learn how to do something else that's semi-related to my job, but not really, like diving deeper into PowerShell. Job title doesn't say PowerShell in the title, but there's definitely components of the job where I'd use a lot of PowerShell, especially in a Windows environment. So that's where I run to there, and especially for those of you that are trying to get your foot in the door in security, if you're in a job that's not specific to security, it's going to be kind of hard trying to justify paying for security certifications, courses, or even going to conferences. A while back, I got the advice of starting to itemize taxes at the benefit of my employer. And that means basically keeping receipts and counting them as deductions on your taxes for paid training. I can sum it up as saying, if company doesn't pay for training and the training happens to be at the benefit of said employer, for instance, learning how to do deep packet analysis, found a course you're interested in, your job isn't directly related to it, but your company would benefit from you knowing how to do that thing or dive deeper into it. Learning how to program, maybe even paying for college courses, certificates, or even a degree. And if your company isn't covering it, this is stuff you can start itemizing on your taxes, whether it be stuff that's career development, books, training. I mentioned conference expenses, a lot of different services you might want to use. So professional versions of things like VirusTotal isn't, I don't think there's a cost to that. Some of the less common things that come to mind would be things like your home office expenses. So that might be utility, rent, possibly part of a mortgage, based on your dedicated workspace. So for instance, this room I'm in right now, it's my dedicated workspace. You can measure things out or just kind of estimate how much of a percentage you have of space you're working out of. In some cases, you might even have a separate office, like one of those workspaces like a WeWork that used to have or may still be around. Some of those things also include your utilities, so phone, internet, your electrical bill, maybe some of the maintenance and stuff you do electrical wise, office equipment, this mic, the monitors I'm using, not necessarily stuff in the background, but a lot of the other stuff around it, the lighting and other things that are that are dedicated to that space. I don't know if you're into buying your own pins. Some people are, some aren't, for one thing or another. You don't have to borrow pins from people for an extended period of time as much anymore. If you decided to go a step further, and instead of just itemizing, and especially in the possibility if you decide to turn some of your skills into a side hustle of some sort, there's multiple business entities you can use. You've probably heard some of these before: C Corporation, S Corp, LLCs, doing a partnership or sole proprietorship. If you're not familiar with these, feel free to look them up and do some research on your own. Some you might hear a lot more of these from small businesses that you may or may not be familiar with or use. There's lots of different types. This is a lot to read and take in. I'd say, like I said, do research on your own. Depending on what works for you, you might want to choose one or another. Each one has their own set of pros and cons, whether it be personal liability, tax fees, and others. In the event I decide to take on some side gigs, especially if I was doing stuff security wise, there's definitely the idea of protecting yourself legally. So that's where the decisions come into play. So my choice, I decided to go with an LLC in this case, and due to the liability protection that can come in handy from a legal perspective, if you ever were to take on a side gig and something breaks as a result of ignorance or just negligence on yours or the company's part that you're working with, definitely want to have some sort of legal insulation when you're dealing with potential lawsuit or damage taken. There's also tax advantages between this and the other ones. Some are more than others, and one reason I want to do this is separation of taxing in general. So if there was, I've done a lot of contract work in my career, whether it be security or not, and there, if there's an option to go file as a 1099, as in getting the money directly from the parent company and handling all the taxes and administrative stuff on my end, I wanted that option available. So speaking specifically to my experience imagine some of you can share this familiar experience with me. Starting off in IT or early on, I had people asking me if I could fix something, fix a computer, set up their home network, do things like that on the side. And, I had a day job, and people, they go, "Oh, you do IT, you do IT work. Cool, you fix computers, and you fix mine." And as I started gaining more experience, those questions, those requests or questions from peers and or friends of friends became kind of a, "Hey, we've got this coffee shop, can you do this thing for me this weekend? You help run cable or set up a network?" It started like escalating in terms of things I get asked to do: setting up Wi-Fi networks, running cable on a weekend, fixing some things here and there. And eventually I noticed this, where as I started, one of the roles I was a member of a local community group, specifically SharePoint, like a local SharePoint group, user group. And I ran into some people that would say, "Hey, can you be an on-call for me while I go out of town?" And da da da. And I'm like, "Well, how would I do that if I'm not an employee?" And they mentioned they were a 1099 employee, so they were contracted out directly. Sitting down and talking with this person, they mentioned, "Hey, one thing that would help you out is you could do it by yourself as a 1099, or you could set up an LLC and do this from." And I was like, "Well, that's interesting. And what if I were to take on a side gig here and there, or in the event it becomes a primary source of income from one thing or another, I can work through that, finding work where I can, and not necessarily focusing on the biggest companies. There's lots of small businesses that need technical help." And so that's kind of how that whole thing with the LLC started. As far as how it's going, a lot of the stuff I mentioned I started itemizing on my taxes, and it's been really helpful in terms of where when companies wouldn't have the budget to reimburse, or by policy didn't pay for conferences for people, I started doing this on my own, paying for tools. And I definitely noticing, and appropriate as we just passed tax season, or the normal deadline, April 15th, for taxes, I definitely noticed differences on my tax incomes and returns as I've been doing this over the years. One thing I haven't done, because I haven't used my LLC as a primary source of income, or even just actively seeking work, has been setting up a business bank account. So like basically separating my personal expenses with the LLC expenses. So yeah, you could do things like take out loans, but I didn't want to add complications just yet. Options still available. Good practice to know. As far as how I maintain all this and kind of keep things organized, and now I can provide some administrative advice. Like I said, when I started off doing this, one thing I'd advise is keeping things simple. You don't need to start a company out the gate day one. Just start like thinking of one thing I did was I'd kind of give myself a training budget, for lack of a better word. I'd say, well, I'm going to use X amount a year for training, conferences, etc. It kept me reining in for the most part. Like I said, I wouldn't want to just go unlimited with what I'm going to spend on conferences, assuming I'm going to get it written off on taxes. I'm only going to spend this much on training, books, and etc. It also made me much more selective in which books and training I would use, and shopping around for courses. When I first started going down the road of security, for instance, I decided to sign up for OSCP. I'm still working on that. I take breaks here and there. It's been a lot longer and less focused than some people that can dive through it right away. But over the years, I've paid for that out of pocket. It muddies the water a little bit when a company does provide training or budget, because I'm used to doing this on my own and not having those funds. So asking for said training gets a little harder. And also, I do it to stay relatively low on the radar. Like I said, I'm not trying to do this to make a fortune, using it as a little bit like basically like the equivalent of a side hustle with extra steps. One thing I definitely do, I advise doing, no matter how far down the rabbit hole you go with this, is saving all your financial and legal paperwork. That means receipts from conferences, tax statements, any of the things you've done, any sort of legal paperwork you sign along the way as you go. One thing I also advise too is that, like I say, do some due diligence on your end, and your miles are going to vary depending on if you're working currently. So if you're working at a company that has policies against this, you might want to tread lightly, or they might have specifics in terms of if there's conflicts of interest or a non-compete clause where you can't work in another competing industry. For instance, if you're working at a company that sells a product and you do side hustle for a competitor, that would definitely be a conflict of interest. So finding the type of work that isn't directly aligned with what you do is helpful. Stuff like YouTube, it could vary. I mean, I could just, if I was doing hack the box challenges, that's not going to really be applicable to what my day job is. So, you just do your due diligence, ask around, talk with peers as well. Everybody's gonna have different experiences. Getting input from as many sources available will help. I mentioned that specifically on this last part because a lot of stuff that started as you learn stuff or go down this rabbit hole, what you know today may not be applicable tomorrow. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier I started off on OSCP. When I started, Hack the Box is still pretty new. In fact, you needed to hack the invite code to get in, and now you just sign up. A lot of courses might have different new things available. Knowing what I know now, I would have gotten into something like VulnHub starting off the gate, and then work my way into more paid services. Up to this date, I mean, ChatGPT didn't exist when I first started in security, so there's lots of things I would have been able to take advantage of. In summary, keep calm and save the receipts. Now we're on to the part of the presentation where this is going to be applicable to those of you just starting off in security, or even just coming fresh out of high school or college and starting off in the workplace, or before you're getting your skills experience. This is the part where all those things come into use as far as funding for things, is building your own breadcrumbs. So you hear about OSINT a lot, and how think of how somebody would find where you live or who you are. You're kind of creating your own breadcrumbs towards who you are going to be bringing to the table for a company. So you're building a portfolio of your skills and things. So things like a blog, which these are things I've also claimed as expenses for my business and taxes. Things like a blog, resources used for YouTube and other things. Start building that portfolio, and by the time you're done, or as you progress, companies are now coming to you. So I mentioned a blog, for instance. One thing I find valuable is, okay, now this is the part of the presentation that I'm speaking to those of you with limited experience. Some of this could be either you just started college, you just finished college, you're in IT and trying to work your way into security side of things, or some other field outside of it altogether. What you're doing is kind of you want to build breadcrumbs, and I mentioned that with the OSINT. You're starting to build your portfolio. So basically, you want to kind of show your work and your interest in things and how you're building up skills. And when I mentioned all that stuff earlier about taxes, one thing I did was I created a blog that has a bunch of links and stuff on it. Things I've done over the years, conferences I've gone to, different things I've learned. And I did this in an effort to kind of fill in those gaps where I didn't have enough security experience. For instance, if you were to do an NS lookup or look at my domain reputation for my blog, it's been around for years. It has a track record of being around, available as legit site or resource you can go to. You'll notice down here at the bottom, I have GitHub history. So if you're mentioning things you've been doing actively and you reference your blog and things like that, this kind of shows a track record. Oh, this person's pretty active. Here you go. Another thing you can do, I advise doing, is assembling a crew of people and building up those skills. So I mentioned back with LLC, and here's what I do hypothetically. If I were starting all over again in IT, you just finished high school, you're about to start college, major computer science, or you're planning a trajectory about 3 to 5 years of being in security. So what you do day one, start, maybe if not by yourself, starting an LLC to work through and doing things like volunteering on open source projects and things. You're building up those breadcrumbs to get that experience. Picture this. You've started college, you might do some volunteer work, you're doing it through your LLC. By the time you've graduated college, instead of competing with other people with yourself or your peers with no experience, with just a degree, you've been working at your LLC for X amount of years, under your company name, and you don't need to give yourself a job title like CEO or something like that. Get in mind, look ahead and see what kind of roles are available for people with 3 to 5 years experience. Give yourself a title similar to, and then start working towards that. That doesn't mean you don't do any work at all and just finish school and like, hey, I was at this LLC. No, that's where things like your portfolio get built up. Any sort of work you've done during that time, you have that in a portfolio of some sort saying, look, I've been doing this, I have worked on these projects, and things like a GitHub repo are really good at showing that. Things like conferences you've attended, talks you've done along the way. These are all things that you can do on your own without working under a company. You don't necessarily have to do it on your own. You can also assemble a crew of people to work with. One thing that was helpful for me was having peers I worked with. We would do CTFs together, go to conferences together and do things like that. Maybe even just doing Google Hangouts and working on different things, working on tools, going through, any of the stuff you do towards your end goal of working in this field will be helpful. Volunteer work comes in handy too. What does the Navy stand for? Never get volunteer yourself. Well, I tend to be pretty hard-headed in that regard and would volunteer myself a lot, working at conferences. BSides is my first one. I've also done volunteer work for DEF CON and a few other conferences like DerbyCon. One thing that's valuable about this too is telling your story. You may as well get used to documentation. Regardless of which role you're going to work in the tech world, even outside of security, you're going to have to do some kind of documentation at some point. So the more practice you get at that and the more comfortable you are with that particular soft skill, the better. Don't be alarmed though, volunteering can be kind of fun and a rewarding experience. And as I mentioned, volunteering can be a rewarding experience. And like I said, volunteering can be a rewarding experience. I'll leave the link for this clip here. For more information, specifically the things I'm referencing in this presentation, you can't click on these right now, so I'm going to leave these all in the description. Feel free to check out any of the links there for more information. As I said, you'll notice here there's a lot of stuff specific to California. Get to know the laws that apply to you locally from not only a legal perspective for businesses, but from an accounting perspective and taxes. If you want to get a hold of me, my contact info is here. The last slide, of course, was reserved for questions. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you have questions, as I mentioned earlier, feel free to generate conversations in the comment section, leaving them there. Give me a like, feel free to subscribe, and share this with people that may find it valuable. Have a good day.